And, approval ratings going down, start of war. It's literally that. So, but since he's already been attacking the media and media independence and trying to push for censorship online, and censorship of social media started way earlier. There was a lot of it under Obama, actually, of attacking anyone who was critical of Obama's foreign policies and quietly moving to get people who were friendly to the ruling regime in power. And yes, I said regime because the U.S. is not a democracy. That's a freaking lie that we tell people that it's a democracy. It's an oligarchy, plutocratic oligarchy that is ruled by the rich, and it has been for at least a generation in the United States. This is probably something that goes back to, at the latest, the 70s, and most likely really to 1944 and the Rigged Party Convention. That was the death knell of any real democracy in the U.S. is the rigged 1944 Democratic Party Convention. That the Democratic Party bosses got away with that. Yeah, that was the death knell for there being any real democracy in the United States. Ironically, while FDR was still alive and fighting fascism in Europe, the seeds were being sown for the end of democracy in the United States. Though he was too sick to really realize it or pay attention to it. And the Cold War. The Cold War became an excuse for eroding democracy and setting up far-right regimes that were friendly to the U.S. all around the world, which that is, I don't know if you've heard the imperial boomerang, but any form of oppression that's done overseas eventually comes back at home. The chickens come home to roost, and that's exactly what's happened. That's what Trump really represents, is the chickens of fascism oppression that the United States has been supporting overseas. We've never been a quote, force for democracy and freedom. That's an outright lie. This has come back to mess with us at home now. Here we go. Age of exploration. Global trade is now required for scientific revolution. That's new, I think. With the ability to sail around the world, ships of exploration are soon followed by train vessels. The race is on to transport goods between continents for profit. Global trade markets, jolted by booms and busts, created a world economy. Or create a world economy. Yeah, I'm not sure that was strictly necessary for the scientific revolution, although it certainly helped. Alright, information aids. You can now get just having atomic bombs and transistors. Don't need internet or any of that yet. Even computers. Interesting. Anyways, biology, chemistry, general anesthetic, molecular biology, map the genome. Television, computer terminals. Oh, ARPANET, internet. Need that for the emergent age. Biotech, nanotech, mind uploads, machine learning, AI, Singularity. Boom. Cars, drones, blah blah blah. Humanoid robots, virtual reality. The propellant, rocket. SBM's Sputnik. Yep. People say the Soviets were a failure, but they put the first satellite in space, the first man in space. We sent the first probes to many bodies in the solar system. For a country that started with 1/13 the GDP per capita of the United States, that really is extremely impressive. They absolutely were not a failure. They just faced a massively more developed and powerful bloc that they had very little chance of beating, and yet they came very close. The Soviet bloc made it aggressive showing in the Cold War, had a real chance of winning, actually, by the end. Although the odds were strongly against them at the very beginning. With starting conditions, they managed to beat the odds well enough that by the end of the Cold War, the odds were actually much more even. If they had just survived the crisis of the 80s, the US was already getting close to self-destruction, which is already happening now. They looked at the current era, the whole world was seeing the US was destroying itself, and they would have shied away from US influence and sided with the Soviets more, and that would have been the death knell for capitalism. The Soviets would have won the Cold War if they just lasted till 2025. Crisis in the Kremlin Let's Play series, you'll see some of this, although after getting to where I could beat normal difficulty, I moved up to hard, and now I keep losing hard over and over. It's really hard to beat hard, and it's almost impossible to get above hard. You have to basically use exploits at that level, which have been patched out, but that's a Solzhenitsyn difficulty, which assumes that the critics of the Soviet Union were fully true and maybe even understating things, when in reality they were grossly exaggerating problems. Hard difficulty is actually to assume that, Soviet records were highly inaccurate and they were lying about things. Things are worse, just not as bad as the critics say. The realism difficulty is normal. I can consistently beat realism, but still working hard. For one, you have to import a lot of luxury goods from the West until you get some technological breakthroughs that you produce more luxuries at home, and can move to a mixed market economy similar to China. That'll help with luxury goods production, similar to modern China, that is. Or you can massively scale up your service industry, and the light industry would start off weak, and then you can produce more luxury goods domestically. Plus, you really do need certain breakthroughs in pure technology that'll aid your central planning efforts, because that's another thing. Central planning would have become more efficient as we move towards the age of the internet. Soviet Union would have benefited hugely from the information technology revolution that started really to gain speed. It started earlier, but really gained speed in the 90s. The Soviets lasted to benefit from that. Their central planning, which already produced between the second and third highest long-term GDP per capita growth rate in the year consistently, they were at no point in history beat by more than two countries in their long-term GDP per capita growth rate. And those two countries that ever managed to beat them were Japan, which horribly exploits its workers, very long hours and such, but that in turn leads to higher economic growth rates. I'm not sure that's the benefits worth the cost there, though. And France, until the Bretton Woods gold banking system, the French bet very heavily on, and the petrodollar, which was tied up with it and still exists, but prior to the Bretton Woods, the petrodollar was something to benefit any country that was willing to invest in it. After the end of Bretton Woods, the petrodollar could only benefit the US, and this is why the US became even more aggressive in trying to control the global oil supply after the 1970s, that and the oil crisis. Which is part of, this was a strategic decision of Nixon's to make it so that the US could benefit far more than anyone else by controlling the world's oil supply, and then to go using imperialist power to gain control of oil to end the oil crisis of the 70s. And in the 80s, there was actually an overproduction crisis, which was intentionally triggered in order to try and crash the Soviet economy because they were a net oil exporter. And that worked to a large degree. Although they would have recovered, or maybe even could have, if they'd recovered from the crash or avoided that crash, the Soviet Union very likely could have survived. Also, Gorbachev wasn't trying to aggressive political reforms during the middle of an economic crash, or rather, he started his reforms before the economic crash. Some of his reforms made the Soviet system already unstable, because they were destabilizing things like moving away from central planning towards more workers' cooperatives, and even introducing elements of capitalism to the system, towards like a mixed market economy like China, or maybe even some say that he was just trying to end socialism. Depends who you believe. But he did that right before the oil crisis hit, and that resulted in horrendous economic instability, which also political reforms on top of this, and economics and politics affect each other. When the economy is bad, politics become more unstable, and he did things that already destabilized politics. And the collapse of the Soviet Union was ultimately not an economic, but a political collapse. But economic collapse has contributed to the political one. Of course, capitalism coming to the former Soviet world horrendously messed those countries up. It was not some good thing. It led to massive numbers of surplus deaths. Same, counting method we can use to figure out how many people died due to the COVID pandemic shows that I think it was 10 million people died to the collapse of the Soviet Union. Over 1 million just in Russia itself, but a lot of people died throughout the third world who depended on Soviet aid, which the US did not step in and fully replace all the aid that the Soviet Union gave to other countries, and places like Kazakhstan and Ukraine and so forth that broke off the Soviet Union. And Warsaw Pact countries that saw their healthcare systems collapse right as the HIV pandemic really hit the world hard, which led to a massive number of deaths due to HIV in these countries. People who didn't immediately die, but would die in future decades because they acquired HIV because the healthcare system was a mess and wasn't able to properly provide public education on the need to be careful and provide testing and such that could have controlled the spread. So there's very high rates of HIV in Russia today, for instance, because of this. Compared to any other developed country, that's a permanent burden on the country. It's not going to go away until HIV is cured. This is part of why the US is not that aggressive in actually trying to cure HIV, is because it hurts one of our main rivals far more than it hurts us. Don't you love imperialism? And then the ways we treat HIV and try to erase it and try to deny people disability to it tie directly to now how we treat people with long COVID. Because the same systems of erasing and not talking about, or the same patterns of behavior are being repeated again. Politicians learned how to do that, and now they're doing it to long COVID. And so, even though I got COVID, which is an airborne disease, from a roommate who came back from a business trip infected with COVID, no fault of my own, techniques of ignoring massive long-term chronic disease crisis that were pioneered with HIV, something that you might blame more on the victim for getting it for responsible behaviors, though there's also people who had accidental needle sticks, or they had a partner that they weren't using protection with because they were married or something, or a lifelong partner, and they didn't expect them to cheat, get infected with HIV, and then give them you can't blame a wife, or for that matter, a husband who got HIV from a cheating spouse. That's not their fault. You can't blame the nurse who got it from a needle stick or blood spatter in the eye. Stuff like that. A lot of people got HIV. It was no way their fault. Maybe not a high percentage, but a large absolute number of people. Accidental needle sticks, cheating partners who they were not being irresponsible with, but their partner was cheating and they had no idea, of course, because that's how cheating works, is people hide it. One time my father actually cheated on my mother and almost got, turns out he almost got HIV from someone who was HIV positive. He did not, thankfully, but that could have happened to my mother, and it wouldn't have been her fault. So yeah, that hits close to home. But anyways, so the bottom line is capitalism is vile. Soviet Union didn't have to collapse. Odds of, when you look at things like the literacy rates in the Soviet Union and their GDP per capita when the Soviet Union formed in 1921-22, odds they could ever beat countries as wealthy and developed as the US were incredibly low. But they managed to hold on. They managed to beat the Nazis, which, when you look at the numbers, it's a little bit surprising that they managed to beat the Axis powers. Not if you just compare it to Germany, but you have to remember Germany was allied with Italy, Hungary, Romania, and Bulgaria. And they had collaborators, quite a few of them in the Baltic states. When you add up all the Axis powers and their collaborator regimes, including Vichy France, kind of sort of helping them, and Franco Spain, the odds were actually pretty low that the Soviet Union would manage to beat them, even with the help of the United States, which didn't provide nearly the scale of help that's often represented. It's exaggerated. The U.S. provided some critical aid, it's true, but the majority of weapons used in the Eastern Front were made in the Soviet Union, for instance. What the U.S. provided that was particularly important was food aid, because the Nazis destroyed so much Soviet cropland, there would have been a famine if not for U.S. food aid. In fact, many people did starve to death during World War II, particularly prisoners of war. This is something that the Trummanites, is that a phrase? The Cold Warriors weaponized against the Soviet Union, because the death rates in the gulags were very high during World War II because of the food shortages, because of the Nazi destruction of cropland during World War II. This leads to statistics that if you don't omit the World War II years, make people able to say that the gulags were these horrible places where everyone died. It's not true. They had high death rates. It's true compared to the prison systems of most Western countries, but they also tended to give people very short prison sentences to make up for that. Judges were aware of how harsh a sentence in the gulag was, so you got a short sentence, and your chances of living to the end of a sentence in the gulag were about the same as living through the end of a sentence in the U.S. prison system before certain reforms Obama made, so during the Bush years. Because you would get a much longer sentence in the U.S. prison system, so even though you'd have a much lower chance of dying each year. Now, admittedly, people died just not through the oppression of a prison system, but due to natural causes while they're in prison. So that, when I say that, what I'm saying is true, but it doesn't account for the fact that some of these people would have died out of prison. The surplus death rate is a little different from the absolute death rate. In fact, people who go to prison often tend to be very poor and oppressed and unhealthy to begin with. So the surplus death rates of U.S. prisons aren't nearly as high. And when you compare surplus death rates of U.S. prisons and gulags, it's a very different story. But especially since people who went to gulags tend to be healthier, whereas people who went to the U.S. prison system tend to be unhealthy to begin with. But all that said, the statistics that are often cited completely ignore that the vast majority of deaths that are being cited were during World War II, during the Hungry Years. I think what the Russians call them, they have a term for it, something like the Hungry Years, that were caused by the Nazis burning crops as they marched east before they were stopped at the Battle of Stalingrad, and I forget what, there was another key battle everyone forgets the name of in the West. And, they were not just burning down the fields, the Nazis were burning whole villages to the ground, murdering civilians left and right because they were that evil, particularly in modern Belarus. This is part of why Belarus was, much of the Soviet Union broke off completely from Russian influence after the fall of the Soviet Union, former Soviet Union. Belarus is still very much dominated by Russia. And part of that is because of the massive damage that was done to the region under the Nazis that never fully recovered from. And then on top of that, that created distrust of the West and of Germany, which I would remind you is part of NATO, is part of the EU. So Belarus rightly distrusted Germany. And, Germany is militarizing and going to the AfD, which is neo-Nazi party again, so that distrust is proven warranted. And now there's talk of basically a German invasion of Russia again, which would involve Belarus because they're an ally of Russia. They have a defensive pact. So there would be Germans burning fields in Belarus all over again, most likely. With the AfD being a neo-Nazi party, they would murder civilians left and right. So history might be about to repeat itself. But Russians were rightly worried about something like this. Anyways, that's enough of this video. I hope you all enjoyed this. Take care of each other. Be kind to yourselves. And may you always find a guiding star to lead you on. Adieu, and best luck to you all.